Alright, hi everybody. So, we decided to start a podcast. This is for hopefully the first of many episodes where we would be sitting down with people that we meet on the internet to just chat about different things. Not really a debate, more of a conversation, just to gauge where everybody's at, what the world is coming to. Now, for this first meeting, I guess we would call it, I have a friend of mine, Jay, that we met online on Discord. Say hi, Jay.
Hello.
Yeah, and what the purpose of the episode, or I guess the show as a whole, would be just to talk about different viewpoints to get the outside perspective on different issues, things happening in the world. What happen is a lot of the times people just discuss without actually hearing the other person, and that's not really what a discussion should be. So kind of hoping we can like talk more in depth on this idea. I mean, just look at what's happening now. Like Jay and I both know like has been happening with recently in the United States at the very least, with the politics being an absolute fucking mess. Stock market, pandemic. I mean, where do we start? I guess we just gotta. What's like the worst one?
I don't know. It's very difficult because there's like an undercurrent of like so many like depressing things occurring. But if you were to say what is the biggest problem as of now with all this drama, I don't know. I just have to always ask myself like, what's keeping us together? I guess, and like how our strength, how like that which is keeping us together is like slowly decaying. I hear a lot of conservatives, especially here in America, talking about like the deterioration of the social fabric, the decline of culture, the decline of like accepted values like individualism or like freedom of speech. And for me, it just always seems quite odd when we see those values sort of being like upheld in the most hypocritical ways possible. And like, I don't know, I just often find that like whether it's Trump, whether it's the pandemic response, whether it's the stock market potentially, all these things to me, they just all circulate around this one thing that we, call like our political economy. Whether it's good or bad, that's another question. But it's always something to wonder how capitalism, that is the political economy of America, fuels or in any ways helps to create or stifle these progressions. And before we even get to that question, if we want to really talk about online drama and just the shit show that it is, it's very interesting to sort of ponder this one theory. A while ago, I was reading a book about essentially explaining the difference between playing video games and the action of playing. And essentially, what they came to conclude was that playing video games was an idea, or rather an activity that cut you off from reality in a way. It was an engaging activity that outs you off from the outside world.
I think the common
And
terminology for that would be escapism, right?
to an extent, and here's the issue, because what I just said is the magic circle, essentially. But the issue is that it's not necessarily an escape, but rather it's actually a mechanism of coping. And sort of one of the justifications for why I say that what I say is essentially there's this idea in this book called The PlayStation Dream World by, I believe, Alfie Bound. He seeks to explain the role of ideology. So let's clear up what is ideology first off, because I think ideology is a very complicated mechanism to explain. But once people can understand that, I think people can really understand the difficulties in achieving potentially intellectual conversations, and also seeing why a lot of these conversations get torn apart, or people can't really come to accept the conclusions that you come to.
Right, so to start with, we'll go with I guess, the official definition of what an ideology is. We would often, what's the word here? We would attribute a lot of actions that an individual takes, beliefs that they have to be because of a certain ideology. It's like, oh, why does this person believe X and Y? Well, it's their ideology has driven them to doing X and Y. So it's kind of important if we are attributing a lot of those actions, a lot of these decisions to an ideology, to know what makes or defines an ideology to begin with. So yeah, we can go ahead and start with that.
Sure. Yeah, and this is one of the very beautiful things about and scary things about ideology is that it's not only blatant messaging that we prescribe ideology to, but it's also subconscious messaging. And one of the things that we're currently exploring in the cognitive science and neuroscience and any department per se that deals with understanding the mechanisms of the consciousness is both trying to understand what consciousness is, consciousness as in the actualization of our thoughts, meaning that which I produce in reality from what I express internally to myself. And this is a very difficult topic to sort of explore because a lot of people are sort of pondering theories regarding what consciousness is. And on top of that, there's an even more complex mechanism that is eluding the academics that we are currently exploring, which is the subconscious. And so far, the only really, as I know, the only theory or really hardcore theoretical measures that I've seen sort of trying to explain consciousness has a lot to do with pop philosophers like Zizek or more back in the day psychoanalysis people such as Freud or Jacques Lacan, who is probably the most prevalent figure in this field that I know of. And I just sort of want to start off with a quote by Zizek that sort of explains something very interesting about ideology. So he says, "I already am eating from the trash can all the time. The name of this trash can is ideology. The material force of ideology makes me not see what I am effectively eating."
So
I
I'll have
Yes.
I'll have to bring down a bit down the level, because not necessarily everybody would have the, and myself included, just to make it clear, have the academic background to sort of understand what the author meant. The good old funny joke about, oh, well, why was this? Why did the author say the sky was blue? So what is he describing in layman terms when he's saying that when he uses an ideology, what's the allusion to the garbage can, basically? What is it?
So sure. So it's like this. So the reason why Zizek chooses the trash can in this case is because he's trying to be very provocative with his saying, and also sort of demonstrating how something is nasty, something is foul as a trash can where we throw garbage in. How essentially ideology can take on the most horrific traits or most ghastly traits that you would never think of ever agreeing with. But in reality, in the subconscious, that is, you do agree with some of these traits. So this is one thing that's very interesting about psychoanalysis, or rather about the study of ideology that Zizek poses, is that we as regular people, we do not know what it is that we know, and the things that we do not know but yet know, meaning like our unconscious knows these things but our conscious doesn't really. The conscious is like us speaking right now, me, the thoughts you're coming to process. The unconscious is what's, we don't really know how the unconscious and conscious work, and that's sort of what we're planning to explain, like that mechanism. But for now, we make one of the fundamental assumptions, or rather I would, which is essentially that your unconscious feeds you thoughts that your conscious tailors onto and make its own form of thoughts.
Yeah, there were
Um,
examples of this in something as simple as food cravings.
mm,
This was, I'm sure you're familiar with the example. If, for example, a person is deprived of a certain vitamin, mineral, or
mhm,
otherwise there's some resource in their body. I mean,
mhm,
it's as simple as you being thirsty, or you finding the idea of drinking water very appealing. Now, we, in the 21st century, have enough knowledge to say that, oh, that's because our body needs water. But it's not that a cave person understood why they felt like drinking water, that, oh, this was in response to the body. So in the same way, the body, in this case the unconscious, would be informing you into a lot of ideas. I mean, it's as simple as delivering an endorphin. Why do you feel good when, you know, you're close to another person? Why do you feel better when you're in a social circle rather than being ostracized? There's no physiological need for that necessarily, but Your unconscious informs you that this is a good thing to have. It's an impulse. It's not that you came to a logical realization beforehand. It's more of first you feel good or bad about certain things, and then you ascribe meaning to it afterwards. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, to an extent. The difficulty is that sometimes when we describe actions as simple as that, people sort of attribute that development of action wholly to some sort of biological mechanism, which is true to an extent, but we have to look in reality and see how we have some agency as humans in the engagement of our actions. So, of course, more context would have to be applied in situations like that. But in general, usually it is both a mixture of like this. I'd argue that if we were to discuss this issue at large and say, how much agency, how much choice do I have as a human being? And then we were to say like free will versus like
Yeah, I was
ideology or
literally about to say that. There's this whole debate online on many different communities, many different online places about whether free will exists or doesn't exist, and even regarding its definition. So
Mm,
I think, speaking as somebody who's a utilitarian, so a person who focuses quite, maybe I'm butchering the definition, but I think it's a good description nonetheless. And a utilitarian being somebody who looks at the utility or the use of certain beliefs and asks themselves, well, why is this useful? I would say in order to live in a society, just to be alive, we have to make certain assumptions. We have to decide, okay, do we act as if people do or don't have a free will? And I think it's a lot more practical to act on an institutional level more towards people being affected by their environment, and on an individual level to act as if, well, you do have free will, because that way the society, in my personal opinion, this is, I guess, a separate debate, separate episode in itself, would be the most useful, the most well-functioning. Oh, I got a bit of an alert on Facebook. I think this would be, we would have to assume, for the purposes of just discussing with people personally, whether it's here, whether it's in online, whether you're meeting a person at a gas station, that yeah, those people do have a free will and they have agency over their choice, at least for the most part. Because if I don't know if this is your necessarily viewpoint, you could just throw your hands up in the air and it's like saying, oh, well, I can't blame this individual for anything he or she says or does because, well, it's literally because of their environment. They don't have free will. It's literally just cause and effect. Which can be true, but there's not much utility in acting that way, right?
yeah. So one of the difficulties with this is because people are sort of ideologically primed. That is to say, when people come to decisions regarding the justification of criminal actions, people are always like primed to think to push to one extreme or the other. The first extreme would be like, oh, we should completely absolve him of his condition because he is born in a progressively he's born in demonstrable conditions. Essentially, what that means is like he was born in like a really poor neighborhood that experienced a lot of material inequality in comparison to other neighborhoods. The comparison between white neighborhoods and black neighborhoods. The black neighborhood receives less school funding, more criminal crackdowns, more police enforcement. The white neighborhood receives more, vice versa, receives the opposite of those benefits. And essentially, that's one extreme, and it's a righteous one to pose. But the other extreme that we have to understand, and this is the one that most of America views it as, is that they had the agency, they took the action to commit this crime, and it's and therefore they are we should take them to court on that, purely on that basis. What they did was injustifiably wrong. So the first extreme is to absolve a person's blame with regards to a crime, and the other extreme is to completely entirely impugn the person of blame, to say that what you've done is wrong, atrociously wrong, you must be punished. And the difficulty in sort of bridging the gap between the two is both saying that they're right and then that they're wrong, because I could be posing a false dichotomy here, but in large part, the people who I am speaking about here are the general populace of America. And what I try to establish here is that we tend to jump to these extremes because we've already been in an environment, we've been digesting narratives for the entirety of our lifetimes, showing vicious criminals, showing super poor, impoverished people. We've only ever seen the extremes in media and never truly the realities, because the extremes in media are what the media is designed to essentially express or to create. And that's not a bad thing either, or a good thing. It's just the natural role of the media. It's to give us information, and the process by which it gives us that information becomes so superficialized. That is to say, we see the media having to simplify things or having to say things a specific way in order to produce more views, more ratings, or sometimes get better information out.
Yeah,
Whoever
I wanted to
decides that.
break it down to like a
Mhm.
typical example that we would have. Because you're
Yeah.
talking about the dichotomy, whether it's false or not, that's a point for a bit later. You would have, I lived in the United States for some while, but I don't recall exactly which news station is for which party, I suppose. I do know Fox News is mostly right wing, or I'm confusing a lot of those stations also with the British stations, like BBC, I think was a British, purely
Mhm.
CBS. I might be confusing some of those acronyms with like maybe just daytime shows. But what we see a lot of the times is what you're saying now, that there's media reporting from both extremes, the far ends of the bell curve, so to speak. So you'd have narratives being pushed very hard, causing people to be basically almost funneled into either of the two political extremes a lot of the times. And like you said, it's not necessarily a bad thing that they are reporting things in such way, because we should see the extremes of either end of the world as long as it is reported truthfully. Now, there's an unspoken, I guess you would call it difficulty or more of a danger, where if you are disproportionately reporting on one side or the other, you're gonna push a narrative. So if I, for example, made a news channel only talking about all the stuff or the bad stuff that the left of the political spectrum does, the channel itself will be a force to deter people from the left and into the right wing, or the opposite, if that's it will be the opposite of what I'm reporting. Same with any news media channel, Twitter. I mean, we could pretty much on top of our heads, I don't know about you, I could definitely say that some places are definitely more right-leaning, left-leaning, where it's Reddit, Tumblr, Twitter, 4chan, what have you. All those online communities, they all have I guess, a political stance in a way, even though it's not guided by any one individual. It's just, I guess, where people pulled up, no?
Yeah, and I wanted to sort of jump on that and show one really interesting thing, because before in the beginning of this discussion, I made the distinction between blatant ideology and then how do I say this, subconscious or more involuntary forms of ideology. And if we are aware of the media we are digesting, that is to say, we are aware of the ideology within us that affects us. We are therefore able to differentiate and then see, or rather, be able to critique ideology. And the critique is what, not rather, it doesn't free us from ideology, but it allows us to move within that ideological bubble to come out better, to
Actually, I
come
have a bit
out
of a
more.
question there. Would you say that
Mhm.
rather than it being like an innate ideology that people have in their subconscious, wouldn't you say it's more of a bias caused by people's past experiences, things that gave them pleasure? Because I wouldn't necessarily say that people have a hidden ideology. I don't know if you have any evidence to the contrary. I would love to
So
hear it.
what I
Yeah.
yeah, so what I mean by hidden ideology, if we want to go that way, because there are biases, sure, certainly, and biases are one form of ideology, but that ideology, I'd argue, is less. How do I say this? There That form of ideology is more individualistic than it is in relation to the world, because it's connected to a deeper experience, or sometimes a more tragic experience. But it is there. It is a form of ideology, certainly.
So
But
something
the
along the lines of somebody being, let's say, I guess I could give one example of a person growing up in a certain community that was very, let's say, poor.
Mhm.
disproportionately so, having
Mhm.
a innate bias against, let's say, a person. Let's say if I grew up poor, arguably you could say I either I did or didn't. I guess I was middle class, but let's say if I did grow up in a very very poor area, I would naturally, without necessarily thinking, based on the experience, the usual experience of growing up poor, I would have a bias against being protecting, let's say, right now with the stock market, the the elites, so to speak, the more rich, more wealthy individuals, because I would have basically lived in a shadow of that, just thinking how great it would have been, and perhaps having some negative experiences with people more better off than me. I would naturally have a bias to be more critical, not necessarily hating rich people, but just criticizing their stance on things a lot more and being distrustful. So that in itself, this kind of, I would call it a lot often a knee-jerk reaction, just a kind of something that you innately do without necessarily thinking about it. That in itself could be considered, I guess, by the functional definition what we're talking about now, an ideology, right?
Right, and this is what's so beautiful about being able to critique ideology is it allows you to fossilize. That is to recognize um, what we call our biases. Um, and essentially, because we're aware of our experience growing up in a poor neighborhood, and then and then we are aware of the fact that um, we see rich people being given whatever media you consume telling you that they're giving free handouts or something that you think is unfair, and you get mad, you get angry. That if you're aware of why you get mad and why you get angry, in a way, because you're able to then see that you do have you do understand what it is that makes you that way, and
Oh,
in
and
doing.
real quick to add on top of that, because I think, and again, this is an I think statement. I don't know how much value this has, but maybe you agree with it. Maybe whoever's listening could also pitch in their 5 cents. When people have those gut feelings about any topic, they try to, as mentioned before, they try to ascribe a value to it. Like along the likes of saying, oh, this, going back to the example of the rich person versus the more poor person, it's, I don't trust these, or I feel uneasy around these rich people, so they must be innately creepy. We try to justify the feelings that we have innately. And if we do it if we are mischaracterizing why we feel a certain way, then we're gonna arrive at a lot of different conclusions, and it's just going to become a more of a feedback loop. I feel uneasy around rich people, so I'll ascribe a negative characteristic to them, which will reinforce this idea, which will make me feel more uneasy. So it's very easy to fall into those feedback loops just because you don't have the right explanation why you have those, I guess, innate ideologies, would you call them?
Sure. We could just call them our biases because we don't want to
Yeah.
butcher the word for our audience.
Yeah, true.
To the
So
point
we're talking about
that
like innate biases that we have because of past experiences for the most part, right?
sure. So yeah, that's more at the individual level. But if we go at the larger frame, that is the social level, when all these individuals are grouped together and interacting in an environment, we see that there's actually something that I call a dialectic, and this is something that Zizek speaks about as well.
Sorry, just to make it clear, a dialectic, right?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
So what does it mean exactly?
So what this means is essentially it explains in Hegel's terms. It explains the movement of concepts. Concepts are what philosophy describes as, I believe, the something like the characterization. That is, we explain what an idea is, and we sort of try to play around with that idea. And the concept allows us to play around with that idea because philosophy is an exploration of ideas, and the concept is the way by which we are able to explore such ideas. So, to get back to the dialectic, in this way, the dialectic functions for ideology as a battle of some sorts. So, this is why one of the amazing things, and I'm not to pivot here, but rather to make the discussion more digestible, is that one of the best ways. So we see the dialectic of ideology in online politics, almost every single day. And one of the beautiful things about online discussions is that online discussions, as opposed to real life discussions, help us to hyperfixate on certain aspects of our identity. And the reason being is because there is not that there is more freedom online, but it is that we are under the illusion of we having more freedom online, as in freedom, as in we are less beholden to social values that we have to engage in our reality,
I mean,
because
there's
online.
definitely some freedom, I would say. Like this,
Yes.
this may be something where I agree, or agree to disagree. I guess at which point we would disagree is online. You can have anonymity, which is allowing you to free yourself from a consequence of a lot of ideals that you may hold privately being public online, which in
Mhm.
itself is a bit of an oxymoron when you think about it. If it's public, but it's online under your anonymous or I guess separate identity, it's not really public, is it? People would think. I myself have been observant of quite a lot of people acting very differently online than what I would expect any reasonable human being to act in real life. I'm sure you have as well. We've been in the similar communities. So I don't necessarily agree with the idea that we don't have more freedom online simply because you have this anonymity. You have the ability to pick and choose your peers' environment, and just the sheer amount of not being locked in with individuals, just the expanse of it. I mean, go back, let's say 10 years, not
Mm.
having the internet. Yeah, like, well, maybe no more at this point. Yeah, 20, 30 years, I guess. You didn't have the ability to reach out to another place on a globe, so to speak, and talk with individuals with vastly different political beliefs than you. You're basically locked in whatever area you are physically at, right? I guess it's just, I don't know if I would say we have less freedom online or that this freedom is only an illusion. Maybe people think they
So
have a
yeah,
lot more freedom than they actually have.
mm.
Yeah.
So let me explain this. So when someone says that I love my freedoms, or I love my rights, I love, yeah, I love my freedoms as a United States citizen, as a American. What they're saying here is that I love that I am free in so as far as I agree to the obligations of the state, because that is what freedom means as a citizen of the United States of America.
Or any
And
country, really. If
sure,
yeah,
sure, sure,
you have to
yes.
abide by the laws of whatever
Hmm.
nation or state you're in.
Hmm.
True freedom is literally being able to do literally everything without any consequence, which is just not
Well,
attainable.
sure. If we're speaking in layman terms, and I will agree on that, I won't be finicky on that point. What I will say also is that when we speak of freedom in the internet, it's not so much that people have more freedom. It's more along the lines of people have more obligations, but in the but by the mere fact that they have more obligations, they are there have more freedoms, more movement within this world. Meaning, if I say things, if I do things online, there are certain social, and when I speak of freedoms here, I'm not speaking of freedoms with regards to the state. I'm speaking of freedoms with regards to the social, the communities that you engage with online, and it's in those freedoms that we find another form of obligation, because that is quite reflective of reality, because the policeman is not really the person who is to hold you accountable and following the law. He comes there after you've broken it.
Right, so
The
this
people
is
who
more
broke
of
it,
a set of repercussions
yes,
to inform you of your decision. Hey, you are still free to do those things, but there are some very negative consequences for you doing those things. So it
the
is a restriction of freedom in a sense of we are creating a lot of deterrence for you to prevent you from doing certain things. Because, I mean, technically speaking, there's nothing stopping me from stabbing somebody on the sidewalk with a knife, other than my moral judgment being that, well, aside from killing being wrong, etc., by my opinion, let's say if that wasn't the case, it would be along the lines of I don't want to do this because I know that the consequence of that is that I will be hunted down by the law.
hmm yeah, and there's a lot of there's more freedom but there's more obligation to maintain those freedoms in the internet, or on the internet, I mean.
If you're not
And
anonymous, you're talking about, are you referencing perhaps maybe what happened to James
this
Gunn?
is general. Well, this is just in general. We could go there. We could go to that level, but I'd argue, or rather, I'd not argue. I know that it's as simple as this, and I'll try to explain this one more time.
Hmm.
Is the idea that because we have bigger, larger freedoms, more freedoms on the internet, we could say and do as we please, to an extent. We are still always limited by the obligations that the internet carries that we must uphold in order to retain those freedoms. The example being, if I go in a server, whether that's on Discord, whether that's on Facebook, whether that's on Twitch, if I go into these points and I make a discussion and I say certain terms, I do certain things, I could feel a certain way, or I would feel obligated to behave a certain way, whether that's me engaging in memes or me engaging in something very radical like alt right speaking or alt left speaking, because I have to feel a part of those communities. But if we talk about nonchalantly just going on the internet and searching things, that in itself has another form of restriction too, because I'm limited to what I search, because I'm limited to thinking about only what it is that I want to think about. And what I mean by that is that people already know what they want to get out of the internet or out of Google. And sometimes what they want can be as simple as just wanting to explore what Google has to offer. And they're already reducing themselves to the limits, to the possibilities of the internet the moment they take part in it because of that. So that's sort of what I'm trying to get at, and I hope I made some sense about that. I hope that makes some sense.
I think I grasped a few key points. So one, not the whole argument, but a part of it, would be that the same, I guess, beautiful things about the internet, the freedom of it, is also, I guess you could say, a limiting factor of it. Is that, yeah, you have a freedom to talk to anybody you want, but also likewise, your opinion, your persona, I guess, is also just as accessible as you have access to many communities. So stating certain things online, being critical of certain viewpoints will inherently draw in or gather attention, right? If you did something in real world, the news doesn't spread as far of it, whereas on the internet, it can gather a lot of traction. That's part of your point, I imagine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the second other point is that because of this freedom, maybe this is a bit where I'm maybe misunderstanding things a bit. People, due to the fact that they have this absolute, so to speak, freedom to just view content and do whatever they want on the internet, they're also at the same time being restricted by the, not service providers, what would be the idea of here? I guess whoever would be making the content, right? You mentioned Google here, being able to funnel down data, or just any platform really. They choose to show you things that they want you to see, whatever drives the traffic. And the illusion of those platforms being unbiased doesn't make the restrictions any less present, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I guess I would say that, yeah, the internet is a bit more free than real world, but it's not without its limits, at least whether perceived or non-perceived. But I think we're also gotten quite far from the original point.
Sure. So let's get back to, because I was trying to explain the dialectic, which was the movement of concepts, the movement of ideology, and how that works with the how that like sort of represents or reflects like discussions online in a really important way, because we're able to hyper focus on specific things online and be less restricted in a way. And that was sort of what we were discussing, is how you're less restricted in a way when you're online as opposed to reality. And now what I wanted to get at was sort of how this dialectic works between me and you, between the people I talk things with online. So we have these different views. Let's start there. We have these different views. So let's take a really, really wacky example. So one would be like, it could be as blatant as this. I think that we should move to a society in which capitalism is unrestricted and we are able to privatize every single aspect of our world because the market is what creates discipline for businesses, and we don't need the state to uphold the businesses to make sure that businesses are doing that which is right because
But
the
it'll be
businesses
for to illustrate the point, we would go with something simpler like pineapple or pizza.
sure that
Yeah.
too, but I like
Well, just so
this
people
point
don't
because
get lost in the idea itself, but more the
Mhm.
exchange that happens between people.
Okay, yeah, let's
Yeah.
start with there. Okay, I'll be because I'm going overboard. Then I see. So like, I like pineapples versus I like apples. So if the person who's explaining to them why they like apples, and why they like pineapples, the reason why they both have disagreements in the first place is because they're both coming off two different backgrounds. This is self-explanatory. They have two different views, and those views are shaped by their experiences of the objects that they marvelize, that they fascinate,
Yeah, it could
are
be the
fascinated.
history, whether let's say person I'll be pro apple, you could be pro pineapple. So my viewpoint could be from the fact that, oh, I just, well, actually in Poland we produce quite a few apples. I could just like apples more because I've had like, more exposure to different recipes, and I personally attribute, let's say, an apple pie to be a point in an apple's favor. Whereas you personally, you would look at more, I guess, the mixes and the juices that the pineapple juice that can be created, and more, let's say, oh, and pineapple can be used in alcoholic drinks, and you would have maybe more exposure to that. So just by our past experiences, as you mentioned, alone, that could be neither of us are really wrong. I guess we could actually exchange those ideas, and I could tell you about all the good apple pie recipes. You could tell me about all the good alcoholic drink recipes that can include a pineapple juice. But
Sure,
we're
yeah.
using that as a opposite arguments instead.
Right. So imagine like the apples and like the apples and the people who like pineapples, like they're fighting, essentially. They're throwing their apples and their pineapple views at each other. And what happens is as it progresses more and more and more, the ideology that has the most power, and this power can be described in a multiplicity of ways, whether that's more people who like apples or more people who like pineapples, whether that's that the people who like pineapples have more logically coherent arguments, whether that's the people who like apples have more emotionally charged arguments. A lot of these factors play into the power of each person's view, and whoever has the higher power level, that is to say over 1000, if we were to meme about it, they are able to essentially win in this ideological gladiator arena. And this is what dialectic, the movement between these discussions is what the dialectic represents. So such a case of this would be someone who says that they love apples. They walk into a room. I love apples. The guy appears. He says, I like pineapples. And then he says, why do you like pineapples? The guy with the apple. And boom, boom, boom. They start throwing off and off their discussions, their points. And as the discussion goes on, from the outside looking in, we see that they become more and more inclined into their positions if they truly adamantly believe in those things. Or it could be as simple as they never agree on the point,
I think the
but more
common terminology here is that they dig in their heels and they become more stubborn. I think this doesn't always happen.
no, it
It's
doesn't.
curious. Yeah, it doesn't
The
always happen, but
expression is
when it happens, it's usually because my personal anecdotal evidence. I don't know if there's any stat that shows this, but it's usually when I guess people don't open up to the other idea and they try to be very what's the word here, apprehensive. So the difference between asking, "Oh, that's cool. Why do you like pineapples?" as opposed to me saying, sorry, that would be the example of non-apprehension. Whereas if I said, "Ugh, why do you like pineapples?" Like why? That in itself, just this difference in apprehension would just a second method would make you dig in your heels, so to speak, and just be even more defensive about your position because at that point you don't necessarily open up to the idea of being proven wrong, right? It's more of a yeah, I gotta prove this guy wrong because he's being a dick.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to explain here, what I'm struggling to explain here is like the dialectic, and the reason why is because there are a lot of nuances in reality, as opposed to in the abstract world when we're talking about the dialectic. because it's as simple as this, really. We have a concept. Do you like apples or pineapples better? And as we move that concept through a series of discussions, arguments, and so forth, the truth of whether or not apples or pineapples are better emerges with whoever has the most power on the opposite side of that view. And that
I guess
truth
I guess we're talking about now the rhetoric, where a lot of people look
well
at somebody's not cadence.
sure, one second.
wasn't it?
Let me finish this,
Yeah.
because this is really important. So the truth of whether or not apples or pineapples are better, when we move this concept to its final point, can never be realized. And the reason why it can never be realized is because the truth is there are always history is never finalized. Our views are never finalized are on the apple and pineapple, because there will always be more discussions to be had. There will always be more nuances to be created. There will always be more progression. Humanity can never finalize their truths because their truths are built on time, and time as we know it is limitless at this point. So the only time we could ever finalize a truth is when we're looking back on it in history. So we could say at this time in 1900s, apples and people liked apples more than pineapples because of so and so. But now, do people like apples more than pineapples? We can never really know. And the reason why we can never really know, even if we have like this statistical analysis, we literally put everyone in a room on this view, everyone in the world, and we put them in a room to see if they agree, to see if they disagree. Our views are always changing on the position, because what people thought of apples and pineapples in the 1900s could be radically different, if not minorly different, than the views we have now on them.
So if I can get you, I know it can be difficult to have like a summary that is one sentence, but it almost seems like the idea is that any discourse, it sounds like any discourse would be pointless, because towards the end, the rule book can change, the environment can change. I would say it's hard for me to maybe wrap my head around this.
Fortunately, that's not true. The discourse will always be of fruitful benefit, because the point of a discourse,
Fruitful. Sorry.
Yeah, of course. The point of a discourse is that we as people engage in finding the truth of our own opinions on whether or not we as people who are as like pineapples or we like apples. And what I mean by this point is that when I engage with you in a Discord, that is to talk with you about something, I am there to understand both your position and understand my own. And in doing so, I unlock something within myself, whether that's more knowledge of my, well, it will always be more knowledge. And that's something very important to discourse, because at the end of the day, it helps us to, how do I say this? Benefit our world in a mutual way. And what I mean by this is we come into this room speaking about these topics based on our prior experiences and based on what we want to do right now. And what we don't recognize is that the world has given us the opportunity to do such a thing. And the world, when I say the world, I'm speaking of not only everything outside of our social bubble and like hemisphere bubble, like that is to say everyone we know, everything that we consume, but I really speak of this larger view.
I guess the cosmic coincidence theory, you could say.
Sure, you could talk about something like that. But
yeah, it's something akin to, well, one, you have the actual physical limitations that were overcome in order for us to be able to communicate. Then you have, I guess, the choice obstacles that we had to have met at some point. We had to have the ideas that would, or I guess, make choices that would have to, trying to compose myself. We would have the choices and the events that would happen that would make us inclined to want to make the decision to talk in the first place. It's not simply being able to. I'm probably able to talk a lot of people, but I'm not necessarily inclined to talk to them, or maybe I just don't know of their existence yet. If I, for example, there's probably plenty of people that would want to, just listening to this, want to comment on their own personal views, maybe have some ideas to share, and I'm able to, the number would be free. But there's also the limitation of, well, we need to have to cross paths in the first place, right?
Yeah, and this is one of the most beautiful things about essentially about the Hegel notion of truth, is that like it seems very paradoxical, you know. Why is it that if we can never reach the like truth of a matter, if the truth can never be finalized by man, why is it that we continue on? And the reason being is because, at least what I believe, is that humans are obsessed with absurdism. We care about a form of progress. I associate the two synonymously because I believe that when we speak of absurdism, we're talking about jumping from one extreme to another. So like nihilism versus existentialism, essentially. So like we just like the notion of progress. Let's stick to that.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
would also add, not to disagree with Mr. Hegel. I mean, I'm not gonna
Mhm.
debunk him. I don't have the sufficient background for that. But when he states that there's no, don't want to misquote him here, you can correct me. He says that there's no ultimate truth that we can find out. Yeah, there's probably no ultimate truth, but there's a lot of smaller truths. I mean, we could say 2 plus 2 always equals 4. That is a truth. And likewise, we could have a truth that people can argue in terms of, should America have a socialized healthcare system? Should people be able to open carry? Because there's enough conditions applied to that. Let's say, for example, when we say, should something happen or not happen, we're already prescribing a lot of limitations. It should be beneficial to society, it should be beneficial to the individual, it should be affordable, it should allow us for the propagation of our species, and it should not interfere with the majority's happiness, I guess. So when we ask those questions, if something's right or wrong, usually there's enough restrictions to be put to not make it an ultimate truth, but rather it's a question of, should people in a society where, if we're aiming to have a happy society, should people own guns under the conditions of the current environment, right? So in the United States, this would be a question of, should the American population be able to own firearms? And then there's of course a lot of implied details in terms of what do we mean by firearm? Are we talking pistols, bazookas? Are we talking rifles, semi-automatic, fully automatic? And what do we mean by happiness? And of course, the implied prescription is that we're looking at the happiness of a society as a whole, rather than saying, well, one individual is unhappy, so I guess we're not making a happier place, right?
Yeah.
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to clarify one more thing for the audience, because I know that when I keep on speaking of this absolute truth and like its futility in the eyes of Hegel, it seems kind of depressing. And like I know I talk about progress, but I just want to clarify when I'm speaking of absolute truth, I'm speaking of it in a frame regardless of time. So like if we were to, this is like the abstract philosophical discussion, regardless of time, the point of whether you like apples or pineapples, or you think guns should be restricted or not, that point will always be there in a discussion. There will always be some contention to be had, but there will always be an absolute truth if we calculate time into it. And when people say absolute truth, and they're talking about Hegel, what they mean is that they're talking about truth in the time frame of whether that be the 21st century or the 20th century. And at this time, there's this notion called relativistic universality. What this term means is that people have a objective opinion about a certain idea, and they've agreed upon that opinion in this certain time. And their objective is the consensus of the subjective, meaning the objective opinion is the most agreed upon one, and the truth will always remain an opinion. It will never truly be factualized, because the truth is something that's created by a myriad of opinions, and to change its form would be difficult. And this is what law sort of seeks to help help to create a more well formatted, well fit, well credible evidenced opinion on a matter, and that is what we call the fact in layman terms. But in philosophy, we go beyond that.
Yeah, a lot of people don't. I guess it's hard for me to say whether the majority of the population does or doesn't do it. I get the impression, and I think you would agree with me, that a lot of people don't dabble in philosophy. We are a bit biased. We are in circles where people do talk about it, but when it comes to just walking outside of our houses, you know, difficult thing to do in COVID times, I guess. A lot of people don't acknowledge things in such a way. They always use their implied conditions, their references, whether it be in time, in society. So they don't venture much out into the hypothetical of, well, would this still be a valid point? Would a pineapple be better than an apple if, let's say, somebody invented 20 more alcoholic drinks for apple juice, I guess. I used to be bartending, I should have known this. There probably are quite a few drinks using apple juice. But in either case, we're gonna take a bit of a break. We're gonna push back a bit and talk more about some biases that people have and what people can do to counter them. Hey, just a quick aside, you and me. If you want to help or let me know that you like the content, I'd really appreciate you liking, subscribing, and all that stuff. I also have a Patreon and a donation page if you're interested. Links are below. Also, check out the description for any links and references to either the guest or the things we were talking about. Anyway, that's it. Let's get back to what we were doing. I hope you all had your cup of tea. So, finishing up on the half of talking about just people's biases and unperceived notions that they have internally. I don't know what to call it. I guess just to summarize it, people a lot of times have, I guess their past experiences shape their beliefs, and they do what is called a post hoc realization, which is they come to a belief naturally. And by naturally, I don't mean it is a logical or rational viewpoint, but they sort of try to justify beliefs that they have internally with facts, rather than learning the facts first and try to justify or pick a position based on those facts. I can see this quite often in a lot of online discourse and a lot of in politics. You'd have people who would feel a certain way, whether it's about the roundness of the earth, whether it's about a political viewpoint, just a bunch of things. And then they look into the research and say, oh wow, this actually makes sense. And they try to play it off, unfortunately, as them saying, oh, this is a logical point because I found a bunch of evidence that supports it. I guess post hoc realization is the best summary of that. Like, you've probably seen it yourself, Jay, a lot of the times online, whether it's in American politics or just online discourse, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, these are like the ideological barriers that stop people from having like fruitful discussions. You know, they're able to sort of like they're not able to question or critique these unperceived notions sometimes because they don't see them; they're unperceived, or sometimes they perceive them, but they're too strong and too attached to them.
Yeah.
I think. Go ahead.
No, yeah, I was going to say that there's some examples of people's I have to be very careful here. I try to be apolitical as much as I can, at least in my rhetoric. And there's a lot of the times where a right-wing person in the United States would look at the extremes of the left. Some of the examples being maybe, I guess on Tumblr, maybe the people going way overboard with some of the left-wing ideals. I guess the most crazy I've heard was to eat the rich. There should be no landlords, there should be no millionaires. A lot of people just would be angry at me for calling that extreme, I guess, but it is a belief that is not too common on the left, so we can call it extreme in that regard, that it is very, very removed from being a centrist. So the right-wing person would see the extreme ideas on the left side, and the left-wing person would see the extremists, something like what happened in the Capitol, I guess, semi-recently in 2021, and say, oh wow, they're just all crazy, and this would confirm their bias further, rather than seeing it's like, yeah, there are some crazy people on both sides. but that doesn't necessarily discredit all their ideas, or those ideas shouldn't immediately be discredited, but more so analyzed why they feel a certain way. Oh, it's just
Yeah.
because they're crazy. That's not really a healthy approach, I wouldn't say.
So the difficulty in because the claim that you're making right now is usually a claim that a lot of people who are more moderate make in American politics. And they subscribe to this idea of horseshoe theory, which essentially asserts that leftism and the far right, rather than being opposite and opposing, they're on like the same range, the same wavelength. When in reality, what goes on is that what the far right does, they've done a lot more violence in comparison to the far left, and this is just purely out of like FBI statistics and a lot of issues that are going on there. I believe it was just a while ago, Canada called the Proud Boys a terrorist group.
Oh yeah, I heard that on, well, read.
Yeah, and
I didn't
you
get
don't
into
see
that.
that at all on leftism on leftists. Like the most, probably the most difficult or the most like hateful criticisms that I've heard of leftism is usually when people like to attack Antifa, or people who are Antifa, and saying that
Well, actually,
um
real quick, before we get into that,
mhm.
since this is news to me as well, something I didn't look into. So, Proud Boys, what group is that? What are they for? Or what do they stand
Sure.
for?
So the Proud Boys are an alt right group who essentially stand for ideas related to ethno states and essentially, yeah, ideas related to ethno states and like very fascist tendencies,
And an
if not
ethno
fascist
state would
outright.
be. I'm gonna try
Uh,
to have a crack at defining this. You can maybe
Go ahead.
disagree with me. And by the way, this is an invitation to anybody listening too, because hell, if we're misinformed, tell us. Because the whole idea of this is to expand our ideals. We're not necessarily married to any of our ideals, and we try to do the opposite of what a post-hoc realization is, and try to shape our opinions based on facts rather than, well, as we talked recently, dig in our heels and just try to defend an ideal for the sake of having it. But an ethnostate, to my understanding, would be just a racially segregated or racially pure, quote unquote, or racially homogenous, I guess, nation where you would only keep individuals of a very specific race and ethnicity in the country, right? That would be their preference.
Yes, and the people don't really have any good justifications for that I know of. A lot of the statistics, a lot of the stats that they choose to use to justify these things is IQ differentiation, which have been debunked countless times
And
by
crime rates, if I recall
Miriam.
correctly, too.
Right, and which are heavily misunderstood, especially because people who oftentimes who do cite the statistics don't understand systemic racism or systemic institutional forms of violence and discrimination that create these crime rates. And another problem is that the statistics. So, like one common statistic is like 1350, which is like just a really it's been debunked time and time again.
Yeah,
It was
this
very
was
popular.
the 1350 being, if I recall correctly, that despite being the 13% of the United States population, African Americans, black people, I guess, are represented as a 50% of all inmates in American prison system, right?
I believe it's something like that.
Yeah, like
And it's just
basically to boil it down even further, I guess just to use layman terms, 50% of the population, supposedly that's the stat that's being quoted here, that 50% of the prison population is African American or black, even though statistically it should be only 13% because only 13% of the United States population is of that ethnicity. Now, the reason why this is being quoted supposedly is to illustrate, well, the only reason why this disproportion would happen is, quote unquote, well, because this ethnicity commits more crimes, which, yeah, there's a bit of a little asterisk at the end. There should be acknowledged that isn't by people of the ethno-state beliefs, right?
yeah, it's a really troubling thing that is troubling statistic that people used to justify their ethno state or to just justify essentially the intense violence and the intense policy that people want to how do I say vote for when it comes to policing in America, and it's very difficult to sort of explain to people sort of the problem that links to statistic if they don't understand how systemic forms of institutional or systemic forms of discrimination occur within these institutions like the police.
Yeah, my understanding is that quoting the statistic disregards a lot of. Well, we're operating under such an assumption if we're saying, oh, the prison and population statistics is all that count. We're assuming, by quoting the stat, that all ethnic groups are treated equally, policed equally, and receiving the same sentence for the same crimes, where there is a lot of evidence pointing to the contrary. So yeah, if we did live in a completely equal society, or at least in US, since this is where the stat is from, then this would be a cause for alarm. The problem here is that is not the case most of the time. There are a lot of counter arguments to say that, well, the reason why this is happening is because the areas where the ethnic population is predominantly full of minorities is patrolled a lot more often. There's institutional sorry, what's the word here I'm looking for? Just not institutional racism, but just lack of advantages that were granted to a lot of races. I think those are
Material inequalities. So
yes, that's it.
Yeah. So the idea of material inequalities essentially is people who are minorities within America that are not white, they receive less resources in comparison to places that are heavily white populated. And that comes from a variety of circumstances. We could link it to the historical institution of slavery and how that sort of progressed after it became criminalized and it became wrong, how slavery was abolished. And then like how we got to the era of Jim Crow, and there are still forms of segregation occurring. It's linked back in history far heavily, and like it's been really prevalent as a result of that. So we see a lot of harm being caused to these minority communities.
Yeah, and this is prime example, I would say, of people doing incomplete research. Somebody would have a feeling of a lot of these individuals, I would imagine. I don't want to mischaracterize anybody, even people of the ethno state, just to be fair, I guess, to everybody. But a lot of people would probably have like an innate maybe the distrust or some racial opinions, and then they would look into the stat and instinctively say, oh well, that clears it up, and wouldn't bother doing further research. So they'll get just a portion of, or just a single data point that would point them towards their conclusion being right, and just staying there without doing enough research. Because
Right.
to be fair, a lot of people don't have the time to make that research. Although it's a little hard to tell people that have a 9-to-5 job to say, just research more, just read up more.
Right, which is why we can't do that anymore. Because this is a big problem that I have with a lot of people who critique people who are misusing or misconstruing information, or even using information that's false. Because a lot of these people like who digest this information, like you've already said, they're living normal lives and they're not like on the internet as much as people like us are. And one of our biggest goals, one of my biggest obligations, is to give people sources, or to at least try to logically explain why the sources that they're digesting are wrong, or like troubling, and you should be critical of them. At the very least, any person who's listening to this, every piece of information that you digest, if it sounds too good, like Wall Street bets, which is another issue we'll get into later, maybe on another podcast, it's probably wrong, or you should probably just double check it. Just be very aware that a lot of people who are feeding information these days, especially when it's trying to be used to back up certain radical positions like an ethno state, just be aware that sometimes the information may be heavily misconstrued.
Yeah, there's some prescriptions, or, well, not literal prescriptions, but more of a prescriptive statement, meaning things people ought to do or can do. This can come from both sides. From I guess, the research perspective, if you're looking into a topic, be aware that data can be manipulated quite easily. Like with the 1350 statistic, it may seem just as an easy gotcha, an easy point. It's like, well, yeah, here's something that supports my theory about the ethnostate. But then if you look into it, it's like, Oh, wow. Okay, I understand now that this is just part of a bigger issue, and yeah, that's why maybe this idea spreads. Is because you can just quote one stat, and to understand the contrary, why this stat may be incorrect, you have to do a lot more research into it. So when you see a statistic, like Jay, what you said is you have to be aware of how data can be manipulated, how you may be seeing an incomplete picture, and be open to other ideas. You should my saying is always, if you truly believe an idea to be correct or a belief system to be correct, you should not feel threatened when other people want to challenge that idea. Because I feel pretty confident about the theory of gravity, so I'm not gonna feel threatened when somebody tries to disprove it to me. If anything, I welcome it because I want to know the truth. People focus a lot more on the ideas rather than knowing the truth. I guess that would be a good way to just summarize it. And for people who are making the content, just to spread it out, or not even the content, but just talking to other people, when you're explaining your position, try to be charitable and understand that, well, people have internal biases, people don't have the time to do the research a lot of the times. There's a lot of, I don't want to call them excuses, I want to call them maybe more of pardons of ignorance, maybe would be a good term to call it. But if somebody has an opposing view to me, and I know for a fact, or just out of the research that I've done, that they are incorrect, I would try to be charitable and describe to them why without being condescending, which is something that's not very common on the internet, as we both know. A lot of
Sure.
people just try to have a poo-flinging contest and just to show off how smart they are rather than, I guess,
Mhm.
showing empathy.
Yeah, I just wanted to point to our audience. So there is a Reddit thread that has a lot of citations sort of explaining these problems with the statistic. It's called No, Blacks Do Not Commit 50% of All Crimes Despite Being 13 to 14% of the Population. And it goes on to explain essentially that the reason for why Blacks are really not committing 50% of all this crime, and why they do commit crime and so forth. It goes on to explain these material inequalities, and then it explains why blacks are disproportionately being arrested by police officers in comparison to white people, and it does a very good job of sort of analyzing these things. So yeah, that's one really troubling statistic. Not a lot of it's been debunked many times. So I don't think many people are using it anymore, but it's always one to keep in mind because this was a statistic that was being used against people who were in BLM at the time, and
Yeah,
it's
and
really
for
troubling.
some viewers, I guess, not my peeps in Europe, I think this has a lot of traction, but I want to make sure, BLM being Black Lives Matter movement, which happened after, oh boy, I'm showing my lack of knowledge, I guess, here.
I
Um,
think it was
the
I think it was right around. It's always been around, but it really started popping up, especially during the
George
death,
Floyd,
the killing of George Floyd.
yeah.
Um, and it was very troubling video. And it just keeps on getting better and better in the sense that like BLM is getting more and more traction, and it's continuing to push for more and more better legislation. And I wanted to clarify a lot of things to viewers who are sort of opposed or confused by the message of BLM, because BLM has been done a poor job in a lot of ways of advertising what it means by abolish the police or by defund the police.
Oh yeah, the terminology here was very
Mhm.
heated.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's very
I'll
troubling.
let you have the explanation on that one. Yeah,
Sure. So when Black Lives Matter, I'll take I think it was did they say, was abolish the police their big message? One second. I think
defund
it
the
was defund
police.
the police.
Yeah,
Abolish the police was for more.
which before we get into the explanation sounds like, again, to a layperson, when somebody says defund the police, they would expect that, I guess, the federal government would just limit the funding to the law enforcement, period, and nothing else. That's what
Yeah,
it
no. So
sounds like. Yeah.
yeah, and that's not at all what it means. So when people say defund the police, what they're saying is that we need to reappropriate the funds that are going to police departments into creating other departments within the institution of the police to go after or to deal with more with situations that are easier to deal with for specific things. So like one instance of this would be creating a department for people who have like mental health problems, whether that's like they have like a severe form of autism, and the police shouldn't be going to like a household and manhandling a person who is in poor mental health. They do too many roles that are really unaccounted
Yeah, I was
for.
literally just
And
about to say that it's a bit strange because anything other than a medical emergency, I would have to call the police. Somebody breaking into my apartment, police. There's a mountain lion outside, I have to call the police. Or I guess, would it be animal control maybe? But a lot of the times, police are the Swiss Army knife solution to any disturbance in society. And to be fair, the police officers are very well trained individuals for the most part. I have tons of respect for them, but they can't be doing everything. You can't expect a person to shoulder so many different situations on top. You could have anything from a hostage situation to a bank robbery to just a person being suicidal. There are some sub-departments, I guess you call it, in the police,
yeah,
whether it's police
and that's what
negotiator or something like that. But there's
and that's what we're
still,
seeking to expand.
yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so like a
There's
defund the police doesn't necessarily, in that context, I understand there may be some people that literally mean it, but the movement itself, Black Lives Matter, when they use this slogan, it is with the intention of redistributing a part of the funds for the
Mhm.
law enforcement to be allocated to new departments that are a bit more specialized with dealing with sensitive situations.
certain crimes, certain situations.
Yeah, like with mental
Because police
health,
don't have
with
everything. Right.
childcare, as a good example. There's child protective services that was there, but a lot of the times when there's like spousal abuse.
I mean,
Yeah,
on top of that, the police are also we're also seeking to because you are right to an extent that the police are well trained in certain very certain districts, but in the vast minority of police within America, at least you compare it to some of the police that I know in like European states, I believe in America they have around like 6 months of training, which is really small in comparison to I don't know if this is the Poland police. You might correct me if I'm wrong here, or the Swedish police, but I think they have like around 2 years or something like that.
I would just straight up say something that people are afraid to say on the internet. I have no clue, but I'll have to do some
Okay.
research on
Well,
that.
I'll tell you this:
Yeah.
the police, in comparison to other countries and within Europe, have shorter amounts of training. American police have need more training. They need more psychological evaluations. They need less. They need less types of crimes to deal with. Need to be more specialized, more focused on certain violent crimes that they can actually like deal with instead of going to every single case, whether that's like a mom having to deal with her child, or her having to deal with like her husband like abusing her or something like that. The police should be there when it comes to literally dealing with active forms of violence, whether that's like a shooting or someone who's robbing a bank. In cases like those, like we'd have the SWAT there at the police. But usually we have alternatives that we should be able to integrate within the institution, within the police system. That's what defund the police means, is it's integrating those alternatives by reallocating the funds to help pay for them.
Yeah,
So
and
whether that's
funnily
Mhm.
enough, now that we have like the actual, I guess, true definition, or at least the Black Lives Matter definition of what, I guess it's just for the slogan, not what the actual words defund the police mean. We're talking about the slogan. So now that we have the true definition of what the slogan is meant for, I feel like a lot of people, if they understood it, would be more in support of. Because if you ask me, would I be in favor of defunding the police, and I didn't understood that there's a slogan and all the connotation behind it, I would say absolutely not, because I support the local law enforcement. I want them to be able to protect us. But if you ask me, would you be okay with reallocating the funds to specialized programs that may be connected to but would be more outside of the police department to deal with specialized situations? So you would have, let's say, one emergency number, but depending on the specific disturbance, it would be handled by either, well, we have something similar right now. We have the child protective services for cases where minors are involved. We will have the animal control for cases where there's a wild animal loose that could be a threat
Mhm.
to human life. But then everything else is attributed to the police. So I would say absolutely. But then again, saying reallocate the funds of the police to the separate departments that would handle different situations and
It's a,
disturbances
it's a
is a
difficult
bit of a long
message.
slogan, yeah.
Yeah. So they have to. do that. But let's not mistake, because there is true emotionally charged language being used there as well, and it's justifiable, because a lot of the crimes that kicked off BLM that were committed by the police were atrocious, and people were angry, and rightfully so. I mean, the man was choked to death. He couldn't breathe, and that's a pretty sad thing to think about. That the police
Yeah, this
just
was the George Floyd case in the. Yeah, and that's what
and
sparked the movement. And you want emotionally charged language in a protest or a movement like that. So I guess this was a bit of a conflict where you want to have your slogan turn heads or ears, however you would say it, but at the same time it being so reductionist, I guess, in what it's standing for, allowed a lot of people to misrepresent it or misunderstand it, which led to a lot of people, well, just opposing it just based off of a misunderstanding, which is a little sad to be said. But that's something we can hopefully avoid with
by
better information.
clearing out by clearing out those distinctions, and like making sure that we can hold the media responsible as well, whether that's through being critical about what the media is saying. When the media is saying things like they're burning down the city of Portland, and they actually are misrepresenting what's actually going on, which is not that they're burning down the city of Portland, but rather that they're burning down certain parts, certain buildings, certain districts, and not the entirety of the city. You can see a lot of hyperbole being used there, because it makes for a better headline, and it's easier to be sensationalist. That is to make things sound more fancy, more excited, more energized, than to actually be truthful. And you have to be very skeptical of when you see things like that, because what a lot of people don't understand is, really, in comparison, especially when the media tries to compare what Antifa or what Black Lives Matter does to what like other like groups do, like far right groups, like Proud Boys or like the Boogaloo Boys, they do a horrible job of realizing that like FBI statistics have been released, which completely counter those proposals, and at the same time explain that we've had around 93% of protests with regards to BLM have been non-violent, while 7% have. And keep in mind, we don't really know what type of violence. Was it a cop who just went in there and started beating up a person for no reason? Was it a cop that like went to like pepper spray? Was it a person who essentially like threw like a bottle through a window?
Yeah, or it
Like,
could be just literally there's a violence between two actual protesters, maybe because, they're
yeah,
just two guys that didn't like each other and it had nothing to do with the actual movement. So there's so
and
many
that's
ways you can mischaracterize a statement. It's the
yeah,
it's the case of a law, I guess, lawyer speak. Let's say a bit of a comedic situation to make a light of it, I guess. Somebody asking me what time it is, or sorry, asking me if I know the time, and I just say yes, and I just stand there. So there's a lot of
yeah,
room for misinterpretation, and this is so important with the media, because even if you are careful with your statements, people can misinterpret it in whatever ways they like, because they have those internal biases. And, well, people can just jump into whatever fits their narrative or whatever fits their anecdotal experiences a lot of the times. So if people have a way to misinterpret your statement in order for it to agree with their agenda, chances are they will. So it is very important for the news media, whether it's in the States, whether it's in Europe, whether it's in Asia, anywhere in the world, for them to make sure to unambiguously report information so that misinformation doesn't happen. Now, we have quite a little bit time left, so I want to make sure to sort of, I guess, do some prescriptions here. I guess what we can agree with, Jay, is just that people should try to, one, be informed and be aware that such misrepresentation of information can happen. Two, that you should probably try to offer some more charitable or understanding approach when explaining ideas to somebody with opposing views. Because let's be honest, you're not going to convince anybody by just saying, hey, idiot, etc., etc. This is why you're wrong, right? It's not an issue in real life so much, but it is definitely an issue on the internet, and people have this passive-aggressive approach in real life too, when they just disregard a person's ideal and think of them as a human equivalent of garbage when they have maybe more controversial views. I try to take a bit more charitable approach and say, well, this person just believes it because they've been misinformed, rather than believing that there's genuine malice behind it. Now, I can be wrong in some cases, but from a utilitarian perspective, it's generally better to at least try to be civil and try to see if this individual can be convinced. Because, hey, what you're gonna lose other than 5 minutes of your time, right?
Yeah, and I guess at the end of the day, if I were to finish off with one thing, it would be that really what this discussion seek to accomplish, this podcast seek to accomplish, the first episode is to explain to people that the disagreements that you're having online, the views that you're being opposed to, there's a lot of problems within ourselves and within our society that we got to fix. And the only way we could ever get there is if we realize those problems and we seek to address them. And
Yeah.
so, like, if there's one question if there's one thing I'd ask that everyone who watches this sort of thinks about is, what are those problems to you, and how can you achieve, or at the very least, become aware of them?
I think that's a great note to end on, because I would even say the only way to get there is together. And if we focus on infighting, we don't have the time or the energy or the resources to address the actual issue. I mean, heck, it takes enough time or difficulty to implement a lot of policies that people do agree on, let alone if you have an entire opposition on the other end trying to do it. You're already fighting the system a lot of the times. You're fighting the real world. Even if we agreed, let's say, on solar power, that it should be the main, let's say, driving force of the economy, then by the time we would implement it, we would have so many challenges. Now imagine, of course, we have a lot of people opposing that, so it's even more difficult. But yeah, each issue, one by one, we just have to address it as a species. Thank you so much, Jay. I really appreciate you coming on, and I hope to see you again on another episode so we can chat. And I'd like to thank anybody listening to, of course, stick around just to listen in. And I hope this has been valuable to you as well.